So today we are talking about world scaffolding for world building. So what that means is integrating supernatural and natural laws. That might be gravity, that might be magic, that might be the fact that your world doesn't have magnetism, for example, all sorts of different ideas and how to integrate them from top level to bottom level within your world building so you don't end up with world building plot holes, which nobody wants because things fall out of them. We don't like that. So let me introduce Nate a little bit more because he is far too modest to say nice things about himself. Our guest today is Nate A. Smith from the World Building School. Hopefully the link will be in the chat. Nate is the founder of the World Building School, which I just found out is 10 years old today. 10 years old this year. Very exciting. It is a website dedicated to helping authors, artists, and role players build their imaginary worlds, which you guys know all about. He's also working on a number of projects, including the Fantasy Map Market, Get Started World Building, and redesigning the World Building School website, which we've just been chatting about a little bit as well. It sounds super cool. So, Nate, how are you doing?
Doing great, yeah, doing great. Thanks for having me on here.
Oh, we're absolutely thrilled to have you. The reason we ended up with Nate on the show, we've been admiring him for a long time, is that my brain just froze there for a second, is that I saw this absolutely incredible diagram, which I'm sure he will mention later, about how to make sure that your world building all sort of filters through the one to the other. And he presented it in this way, like, you might think it's like a Venn diagram, so circles that overlap with politics and geography and history, for example, but it's much more like concentric circles. And I thought that was such an elegant way of putting it, so clever. And he's so good with his information hierarchy and everything that, like, I couldn't help it. I had to get him on. I dragged him by his ear. He is here to talk to you.
I so admit that when I suggested to you to bring Nate here was because back in the day when we were doing Lost Kingdom, Nate was one of my primary sources when we were writing articles. He was an inspiration to me for a very long time. So it was a good reason for me. The moment I saw you in World Anvil Discord, I was like,
no way.
Fangirls. Fangirls majorly.
And now I'm a fan of you guys. So it's all round circles.
All the love, all the love. All right, we are going to jump straight in with world scaffolding. So, awesome. Nate, talk to us a little bit. What does this really mean in terms of world building?
So I guess for me, it's looking at scaffolding. It's the way that you structure your world. Because world building is a massive topic, and as individuals, how the heck are we going to know everything about our world, or rather be experts in everything about our world? Because as you mentioned, there's cartography, there's sociology, there's physics, maths, all that kind of stuff, and as individuals, we're only you're only going to have specialism in certain areas. So for me, putting that scaffolding around is understanding how you can structure your world, but also it's thinking about your audience and the people that you're writing for, and how you're going to effectively, it's that why are you building a world, and what are you going to do with it, what's the end product, and then let's say if you've got a hook, so it might, for example, we think of like the one I always use is Star Wars, how it's samurai and that kind of thing in space, and but for you, it might be something, as you said, it might be that you don't have magnetism. I think that's the example you gave, Janet. So it might be your hook in your world, that without magnetism, what does that mean for your world? What does that mean for your readers who are going to enter your world? What kind of cool things can you do? And I think one of the things you mentioned in our document earlier was about Game of Thrones, which I'm sure we'll get onto a little later, rather. But the idea with that winter is coming, that's just a fascinating concept or plot device that we can use. So I suppose that's kind of my outline.
Very cool. So the kind of laws we're talking about, again, they could be multiple celestial bodies, which might change the day length or the calendar, or even the tides. That's something I've never seen, is that if people have multiple moons, they always forget about the tides. And that kind of makes me sad, because tides are super important. That has a lot of effect on.
We've been reading the other day the NASA article. NASA wrote an article, almost speculative science about what would have happened if the moon did not exist on the Earth, and the answer was we probably will still exist, but things would have been really different. Like the seasons would be different, the currents would be different, the temperature would definitely be quite different, and we would have completely different types of plants and different types of animals throughout the earth, evolutionary since the beginning of time.
Yeah, the other aspect that cartographers are always going on about, and with good reason, to be fair, is the impact of tectonic plates. Where are your tectonic plates?
Yeah.
If there are any.
I think that's a good point. Are there any or not?
And if there aren't, how do you get volcanoes? Do you have volcanoes? Do you have earthquakes? There's these kinds of questions. And for supernatural laws, that might be things like magic or psionics or dimensional rifts, time continuum loops. Another good example is stuff like the afterlife or spirit realms, which, you know, there are the stuff of both sci-fi and fantasy, often rebranded in different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is that's the kind of stuff we're discussing, and we're really talking about consistency and integration between these things.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, for me, consistent integration, those are huge areas. And one of the books that I'm really a big fan of is the Worldbuilding Imaginary Worlds I've got it on my desk here. It's Mark J.P. Wolf. And in it, he talks about some really interesting ideas. Obviously, when he talks about world building, he's talking in the Tolkien sense of that secondary creation.
Yeah.
So Tolkien always talks about how this is our world that we live in is the first creation, and then what we do as world builders, we create from that first instance. And for me, I think you kind of get some world builders who want to change everything.
Yeah.
They want to create everything from scratch, but you've also got to understand that how do you do that? Because us as humans, we've only ever experienced one world. So everything we're changing is going to be a variant of this world. So I'd say it's not a problem to take our world as we've got it and take elements from it. But the key thing is keep making sure that what you're setting down in your world is consistent, and there's an internal consistency. But one thing that, let me bring up the notes, that in the book you talk about is invention, completeness, and consistency. So idea of how much you're inventing. So say you're taking the standard animals in our world, you know, cow, dog, you might decide that actually you don't want cows and dogs, you want to create something else, and that's one step of invention away. But then the amount, he talks then about completeness, and completeness being the amount of that you are inventing. And then obviously consistency, again, being how do you then keep your invention and your completeness consistent? So it kind of creates this little triangle, which I think is quite fascinating, thinking about all those different ways.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and I have to read this book now. So
definitely, I'd say any world builder, it's a big, let's say it's big, thick, heavy book. But it is well worth a read.
Oh, we have it, Janet. It's just yes, we do. Yes, of course.
Read it. Definitely read it. I'm only a short way through, and it's just fantastic.
Wow. Okay, that sounds really cool. So, why do you think it's important to have this kind of consistency and this kind of completeness in your worlds?
So for me, it's I guess it's all about that reader again. So for me, I'm always, maybe it's my background in marketing, right? But I'm always thinking about that end user. Who am I writing for? Who am I creating something for? And if you've not got consistency, that's going to throw out your reader, which I think is probably the biggest issue ever.
It is about immersion, isn't it, a bit? Like
yes,
if you break consistency, you break immersion. It's like the thing that we were discussing the other day, Janet, about the idea that you cannot have a world that everything has 2 legs and 2 arms, and suddenly you have essentially 6-legged horses, because there is essentially consistency. You create yeah, exactly. You make essentially a convention saying, you know, in our evolution, the primary species came out with 4 limbs, and suddenly we have a species with 6 limbs, unless they are alien, or there is a whole other family of creatures like that. Like, for example, tardigrades, which are a completely different family of things with 8 kind of like appendices. You cannot have it like in a normal circulation, if that makes sense. And that's the thing. You break the beauty of the world by breaking consistency, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it, one of my problems with that is that it can feel inauthentic then. You know, I mean, it's one thing to sort of cover something up with hand wavium if the main character doesn't know how it works. And, you know, hand wavium is fine. As you say, it depends on the reader, it depends on the genre, it depends on a lot of different things. But if you use too much hand wavium, if you spend too much time like just with massive plot holes, it's inconsistent and it feels inauthentic. You don't believe it anymore, and that leads to this like fan frustration, if you see what I mean. Like, I want to love your story, I want to love your world, but there's this thing. And I think we've got different levels for different fans as well. So for me, the perfect example that Dimitri was saying was, how can you have a six-legged species when everything else has four legs? How can you have four-legged dragons?
Because
I always look at four-legged dragons and I'm like, you've got four legs and two extra arms which have become wings. How are you doing this? And I mean, you could say magic and wavium, and that's fine, because in D&D there are lots of examples of that.
Or you can say essentially all the dragon species have in fact like six appendices, but then you'd expect a dragonborn to also have essentially something similar to that, not like just to grow wings, like you have maybe something that is small and looks like a wing kind of thing, you know, even if they have
wings or something.
Yes, exactly, something like that. But you couldn't just have suddenly a species that its bone structure wouldn't have these six appendices coming out of its main body kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Or otherwise you'd have other evolutionary break-offs. So you'd have dragons that have six, but then you'd have like little lizards that have six legs. You'd have other things that followed a different evolutionary path. Now, on the one level, that's ridiculous, right? Like Dungeons and Dragons, everyone knows it. Everyone knows what dragons look like. That's fine. On the other level, it stands, you know, and then it's about the line. How much can you, you know, how much can you suspend disbelief? How nerdy are your readers?
Yeah. And how much trust have you built up with your readers, and how much trust are you taken away by doing this? And I think also for me, then that kind of touches nice into that rule of cool, which is actually wrote down a nice little.
I think that as Nate is searching there are things that they are there and they break immersion, and there are things that you can put in your world, understanding that, you know, you can do this step because of, you know, previous kind of like context that people had, even if not from your world. Like dragons, like how do you know what dragon is? You've never seen actually a dragon, but you know because there is this zeitgeist that effectively, you know, dragon, four legs, big kind of thing, wings, dry, like fire breathing, like this is okay. But on the other hand, I think that there are little things that you would do in your world that can break immersion if you don't think about them correctly. And yeah.
And I think what Dimitris said there was kind of what I was talking about earlier about that. I lost my train of thought now. About what is a dragon? Yeah, about I was talking about that primary creation. You know, as you say, the zeitgeist of what a dragon is. Readers are expecting it because that's what they know from our world and what we believe in our world a dragon looks like. So then, when you bring a dragon into your world, you're kind of tied to that explanation of what a dragon is. Rather than if you said, "Oh, this is a dragon," you'd have to go through a lot of description, a lot of working with your audience to kind of remove that idea, and then you've got to ask yourself, actually, are you creating a dragon, or are you better to just create a whole new creature itself?
Right.
And that was something we essentially kind of discussed during our previous discussion earlier today at Tankard's Tavern, that many people have a problem to create new fantasy creatures and species because it is so hard to move this unshakable feeling that fantasy means elf, dwarves, halflings, dragons, whatever. The moment you try to move a step away from there and say, you know what, actually I don't have elves, I have blah blah blah, and the blah blah blah, I don't know, I have like 7 legs and 3 eyes kind of thing. You have to explain everything. You cannot say elves, oh, and people are like, yeah, okay, no, tall ears kind of thing, magic. But
and then
if you don't do that, you
learning
have
curve.
to exactly, you have to essentially find a very fine way, either by writing to use that to talk about the species, or for example in your world building book to go from the very beginning and say 101, this is blah 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 kind of thing, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I suppose, because the question with that is the how that's probably getting onto a writing question now in terms of how do you deliver that information across to your reader. Thinking of, I guess, top of my head, just thinking of The Hobbit. As far as I know, that was the first time I was introduced to the Hobbits, and the way that Tolkien introduces him, Bilbo, is just through a description of what he's doing, how his house is like, rather than saying, this is a Hobbit and this is what they do. He's just kind of talking through his a
It's
really
a
nice.
show, not don't tell in a way kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I think you've picked the perfect example, because in The Hobbit, when The Hobbit was launched, we had no concept of any of those species. Like, everything was new. Elves were new, dwarves were new. I mean, dwarves, yeah, okay, maybe we had like a Nordic, yeah, there were some concept, but it was not popularized. Like, if you were not a hard nut kind of Nordic Wales, Celtic history kind of nut, you wouldn't know at least how they looked. You might have an idea of it, but that's pretty much where it went. And yeah, hobbits were discovered and were explained so very well done by just talking about the hobbit hole. It was a beautiful way of doing it.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing that I'd like to bring up with regard to this, we've talked about problems, but often solving these problems can bring about really interesting quirks to a world. Mm-hmm. So if you introduce, for example, you have no magnetism, then you have to start thinking about the ramifications of that. Obviously, if that's a thing you really want in your world, if it's important for your world for whatever reason, you have to start thinking about the ramifications of that. But that also introduces all sorts of other interesting elements that then make your world a more unique and more interesting place, as well as doing all that work to fill in the plot hole.
No magnetism, dear God, that would have been horrible. There's gonna be no electric generator. Jesus, that would have been a very big issue for people to stick on the medieval times. Like, trust me, that would have been a big thing.
Yeah. And exploration, and for example, the number of species that would impact, because a lot of species use magnetism for different things.
Yeah, like essentially migrations.
Yeah, but also in ways that we're only just learning about.
No, that's right. I think, but when you remove something like that, it's not about. It is a trap to think what it will be removed. The question is how they have evolved.
And that's the question. What if they couldn't use this? What would happen? Would there be no bird migration?
Or it might have been a different way kind of thing. Yeah, you might have animals with extremely well eyesight, so they can see all the way down where they are supposed to be going. I don't know, man. That's a stupid idea, but it would have been something like that.
Yeah. How would people solve the problems of navigating?
Well, to be fair, we haven't solved it until the 1600s. So, that was...
Also, I think that idea of magnetism, that for me is almost what I'd call a fundamental law of science. So when you get into that level of changing your world, you're going to have so many more ramifications further up than if it was changing something that's higher up, say a particular species of animal, or something that wasn't a fundamental law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to talk about that also, then how as you're changing more of these things, what we're just discussing, it's keeping track, and it's back to that triangle of your consistency with your invention, and as you tweak one little branch, it then makes it more difficult to keep track of everything that's going to happen further on.
It is a house of cards, and you remove a card from the very bottom of it. Essentially, that is the idea.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And actually, one of the things I really enjoyed about that model that you presented was that it gave you an idea of where the bleed would be, and that sounds much more scary than it was supposed to somehow. But so Van Cano, and I really should have brought this model on with me so I could show you. Van Cano had this excellent model. Maybe he has it, he can present it, in which you see the cosmos as the outer circle, and then the geography defined by that, and then the people and the species defined by that, and then it sort of goes in like this from the outside to the inside. So if you change something like magnetism, which is in planetology cosmos area, that's going to affect how geography works, that's going to affect how everything bleeds in the one to the other, and so you end up with a point where how much is going to be affected, because you can look at the model and be like, what's contained within the circle.
Yes.
So I thought
There
that
are
was
tricks you can do, of course, because it is like, to go back to the idea of essentially the house of cards. If you create a domino effect in your world, like if you introduce something so role breaking, you can always introduce things that will at least act as like stopping gaps for some of the section that can become like to run wild. Because honestly, saying, for example, there is no gravity in my world, yeah, I mean, that would be like a can of worms you do not want to go in there, kind of thing. And yeah, I think there are ways, and like magic, for example, would be one in some way or form that would be a stopgap for these kind of things, or at least a way to temper it in a
I
way.
guess that's what just to bang on about my favorite book again.
please.
He talks in there about some of the, because basically he tracks world building from its inception and the first world created right through to what we've got today. But also he talks about world building for research and how I can't remember it fully exactly, but basically it was the 2D world that was created, and basically the premise of that is, what if everything was on a 2D plane? Because like for us, we can't imagine a fourth dimension because we're three-dimensional beings.
Yeah.
So then the idea of what would a two-dimensional being imagine? So it talks quite a bit about it in there, about this experiment that was done.
It's a
and
very
world
interesting
build-
experiment as well, because I think I've seen it twice in TV. The one in Star Trek and one in Stargate, I think. Both of them actually use the same idea of like entering by mistake a two-dimensional dimension kind of thing, and the other effectively just jumping through a gate to two-dimensional world. They're like, okay, how do you solve that now? Kind of thing.
and getting your head around it.
Yeah.
It's bonkers.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we were chatting about this before when I was talking about the concept with Dimitri when we first came up with this concept as a theme of the month. And one of the interesting things he said was that one of the ways to show this really well, and this goes back to your show don't tell, is that comes from, do you know Disney's John Carter? No reason why you would.
No, I've only seen the film trailer. I've not actually seen the film.
It's a wacky, gently amusing film. I quite enjoyed it. But one of the premises is that he goes to the moon, to Mars. Sorry.
Yeah.
Now, the idea is that Mars is a planet that is fully inhabited, but because Mars has a lower gravity, he becomes like a Superman on Mars. He can jump really, really high because, and it's a science fantasy, so let's not look too carefully at that. But he can jump really, really high because he has Earth legs and he is on Mars.
Essentially, no other creature on Mars would have the musculature for that, because they would never need it in a low gravity environment. While he comes from a 1.1 g in gravity, which means that he had the legs for it, which means he can jump like 5 times the time of what you would do normally. And of course, if the strength as well, and everything that comes with this enhanced musculature.
I guess it is a reverse Superman, isn't it? Because that's effectively what Superman is on our world.
Absolutely. So he becomes this kind of Superman figure, and then they tie in a bunch of other things to that in terms of the world building. So they have flying ships because it's easier to make ships fly when there's low gravity. They have different kinds of species that are tailored to this low gravity environment. So they take a single factor for the environment, and they've done quite well in spinning this off into lots of different areas that affect the story setting.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's a really nice example of that.
That'd be worth a watch from the sounds of it.
Yeah. It's a very, very entertaining, gentle movie.
It's
Don't
enjoyable,
expect
yeah.
art, but it's fun. So one of my questions I'd like to ask is, why do we think it is so hard to do this? Like, why are there so many examples of boo-boos with this?
I guess it depends on the medium. To film, is it just easier to knock out, maybe lazy script writing because you've just got a deadline, you try to produce a film, try to make a bit of money, rather than actually seriously thinking about the world?
I also think that because you talk about medium, film is more forgiving in ways, because there is so much more around it. If you write like a boo-boo in a book, people will literally like find you and show you down kind of thing, because that's the only thing they do. They just read they just have the reading that they do. In a movie, you're gonna have the science effects, you're gonna have essentially the beautiful women, the gorgeous dudes kind of thing, the animations and everything. Like the whole building kind of get a bit like more like iffy kind of thing. And people were saying, it's a good movie, it was fun, the writer was good or anything like that. But when it comes to books, or when it comes to in fact writing a world in World Anvil or a world for a campaign setting, that's dangerous territory if you do something like that.
Sure. It's also worth mentioning that because movies compared to books are less long form, there's usually less world building. It's more like, this is the set, now let's focus on the characters. But also the team writing the movie is much bigger than the team writing a book. You know, even with editing and everything else, like it's a very, very different process from concept to execution. But I think one of the reasons this concept is so hard is because it requires a lot of thinking in ways that we're not necessarily used to, in terms of like, how would this impact from point of origin to point that we tell the story? And also, how does this impact both on a large scale and on an individual person's daily life? So you get that long lens, boots on the ground disparity. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why it's tricky.
I think it is that processing the amount of data in your mind that you need to work through. I think that is exactly it. It's hard, but also to keep track of it, which is probably where I think World Anvil is a really great plug. It's a really great tool that you can use, because if it's got these content types that are allowing you to input the data, you're not having to keep it in your head anymore, or keep it on a random piece of paper in a folder that when you come to write your book, you go, oh, pants, I forgot about that. You've got it there in a digitized format that can surface that information as and when you need it.
The other thing that I found really helpful with World Anvil, particularly, I don't mean to plug my own website, but particularly when you're trying to figure out the ramifications of this stuff, is you think about the thing that you've changed, and then you go just look at the template's dashboard, and you're like, how would this change every single kind of this template? How would it change vehicles? How would it change species? How would it change geology? How would it change, geography? How would it change the way people build things? Because if you have low gravity, then your buildings look different. You need different kinds of building materials. If you don't have rain, if you just have a very damp environment, but it never rains for whatever reason, that changes everything. You know, and just like looking through those templates and being like, it would change this, it would change that, it would change this, and here are some ways. Yeah, I know that we are cutting to a break very shortly, but I'd love to go through very quickly some examples of this done well. And then after the break, we can go to examples of this done badly, and we can start to dish the dirt.
I think it should be a good idea to ask people on the chat as well to tell us examples that they were
absolutely. So if you guys can think of any examples of this done really, really well, where the world has been super well integrated, then let us know. And again, on the reverse side, if you can think of any examples where we got the world building plot holes that things keep falling out of, then absolutely put them in the chat. We'd love to discuss them. And again, if you guys have any questions, put those in the chat as well. Remember to write capital letters question in front of it so that our producer can see it and get it to us. But going back to examples of this done well, hit me up, guys. What have we got? I would say that the magic in Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy is a nice example. So the concept of it is really simple. She has name magic. But what this means is that culturally, names then become very, very important, even among normal people. So I feel... Sorry, go ahead.
You're absolutely right. I think that the key with Ursula Le Guin was that it was that simple. Like, she had the idea, and it's a very simple idea. Names are powerful, names are magic, names are important. And from that, she started building outwards, and that was essentially a nice way of actually tooling, in many ways, her basis of scaffolding for her world.
I think if we go down the magic route as well, I quite like the Mistborn series. I think that does quite well in the way that magic affects the society, but then also eventually affects the world, because you've got the obviously ruin. You've got the gods that are coming in and affecting that. And I thought Brandon Sanderson managed to do a really good job of structuring his society around the changes he'd done to the magic.
Yeah, and that was very much the focus of that series as well. So it was really important, and it's something that he executed really well.
Mm.
Again, I think you've touched on something important there, which is if it's not the focus of the book, and it's got a little tweaky problem with it, probably doesn't matter as much.
Yep.
You might have a super fan who's like, how could it possibly be that they do this thing? But most people are not going to pick up on that. It's like the dragons thing. Most people don't care. Yeah, if it's not the main focus, you can probably forgive it. Whereas if it is the main focus and if it is important, it's absolutely, it has to be executed well.
Yep, definitely.
Another good example is the World of Darkness, which we know from the role-playing game essentially of White Wolf to begin with. I like this example because no, they don't do any major changes. Effectively, they explore theology as people knew it, or at least as in an apocryphal sense was meant to be, and they kind of tweak it to serve their purposes, and they find effectively how the secrets that theology and essentially cosmology of our own world has and the unknowns can be adapted to become interesting in their own world. So essentially, where would vampires fit in there? How can we create them essentially? So take Lilith and make her the queen, take Cain and make him the daddy kind of thing, and what do you get from there kind of thing? Where do you go kind of thing? And it was a very nicely done and very simplistically done. And they started with something so simple, and then with the Mage Ascension and the werewolf, again they drew from all the like legends from Northern America and the legends from ancient Greece and Egypt kind of thing, and they found little connections. So in a way, you can say that they built not really a world, but a para world or a meta world. But in many ways, also because it's so involved, it's a world on its own right, kind of thing.
We are going to go for a short break, and we will be back very, very soon with part 2. All right,
5 minutes,
guys.
guys.
Catch you later.
Bye-bye.
5 minutes. Welcome back, guys. I'm really, really glad you came back to join us. I hope you have refreshed your drinks. If you recall, just before the break, we were talking about how worlds can be made well in terms of world scaffolding. So that's integration of supernatural and natural laws. Now we're going to chat a little bit about problems in worlds that, while being wonderful and we're really big fans of them, may have some kinds of plot holes that we can look at as examples of maybe natural or supernatural worlds that didn't quite get thought through enough. So guys, dish the dirt and tell me, can you think of any?
We have a problem, by the way, but I'm fixing it. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. All is going to be fine. We just have
Oh, we don't have any faces. That's interesting.
You do have faces, they're just hidden. They're secret in the dark. Bad world building. That's what I say.
No. The night is dark and full of terrors. That's what we're saying here.
We are ready. It's fine. Face them back.
All right, guys. I'm glad that you can see us. We're going to go on with this topic. So one of the examples that I would love to bring up is Game of Thrones. And the reason this is such a good example is because everybody knows it. And of course, the world is so great and so compelling, and the stories are so wonderful. There's everything good to be said about it. But I did find a plot hole, which is we always hear that winter is coming, and we always hear that there are these very, very long seasons of winter. So you get multiple years of summer and multiple years of winter. But we never hear it addressed. Things like, what happens to the plant species? Do they just die off? Because they seem to have a lot of the same crops that we have. They seem to have a lot of the same everything that we have. But most food crops require a cold snap in order to flourish. They require a seasonality. And particularly things like trees require seasonality if they're deciduous. So this is something, it's a good example of something that's really never addressed in the books.
You know what I think about that?
Please.
I disagree, in fact, with you, because I think I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to
No.
break it to you.
This is exactly what we're here to talk about.
I disagree with you because we have an example from Europe during the Roman times and Europe during the early medieval times when we in fact have the small ice ages, and we did have in fact several tens of years of pretty much everything all the way down to Central Europe and below that, like below the Rhine, being frozen. And we still have crops here, and we still have animals here. I mean, there are a lot of processes happening, and cold means a lot of things. I mean, eternal winter. I mean, at this point we have winter. You can walk outside. I mean, it's like you can walk outside even without clothes if you're crazy enough in the UK. We see a lot of women doing it. But I think that okay, fair enough. There's definitely a question there with seasonality, but I don't think the problem is the long winters. The problem
Long
is
summers.
sorry.
The problem is the long summers.
Yes, the long summer is the biggest problem because you wouldn't have any refresh of essentially anything. That would be a problem. Things would have been burned out essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm saying is that this whole setup that he's got with the seasonality is, it doesn't make sense with the species that we have on this planet. So maybe they're a different kind of species. That's fine. And again, it doesn't affect my enjoyment of Game of Thrones. I'm not sitting there on the sofa going, there shouldn't have any deciduous trees. This annoys me. And just like when I see dragons, I'm not sitting there thinking, these dragons have 6 appendages and it's wrong. I'm sitting there going, wow, it's a dragon. But as world builders, our job is to pick these things apart and see how can we do things better. Does it matter? These are absolutely questions that we need to be able to answer for ourselves so that we can learn, because our audiences are getting more and more sophisticated. Fantasy and science fiction as genres are getting more and more sophisticated, and we want to be able to cater for our audiences so at the end of the day they really enjoy what we're presenting for them.
So the question is, if it's not applicable for George to have mentioned them in the books, should he be provided somewhere else so that, like, say, for people that were interested could go and find out? But I'd also argue as well the idea of the narrative achievements and the plot of Winter is Coming is so fascinating as from the other side of world building, taking the flora out of it, but the idea of what you can do in terms of that impending doom that's just constantly coming.
Very true. No. As a narrative device is beautiful, effectively.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this is the question with world building. It's getting that balance for us when we're telling the stories about what's going to be perfect and complete within our world and what's actually just going to be a cracking good story.
Also, what needs to be perfect and complete? One of the points that Trent is doing, which we're going to be talking with, I think, next week, right?
Yeah, next week we talk to Trent.
Yes.
Trent, that's Dr. Trent Hergenrader of the Rochester Institute of Technology, who is a real-life professor of world building. So make sure you tune in next week for that.
Yes, but one of the things that Trent is doing with his system that I'm pretty sure he will be describing in much better detail than I will ever be able to tomorrow, next Sunday, is that he says that, when you start building your world, you have to put down effectively the categories that you will be exploring and kind of like put points essentially in the things that you would like to focus. You cannot write about everything. I mean, yeah, you can write about everything, but even Tolkien, if you think about it, he didn't write everything. He wrote mostly languages, then a story, then some species, kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we have to understand where the focus is and what we want for our experience, our enjoyment, and what our like readers would like from it. I'm guessing as well.
At the end of the day, it's a user experience question, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Like so many things.
Yeah, because we're not necessarily writing encyclopedias. We're writing stories or taking players through an experience. So I think it's definitely those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you touched on this earlier. It's how do you convey this information? And again, with the case of George R.R. Martin, maybe he has special trees that work. Who knows? Maybe he's thought of it. But if it wasn't relevant to the plot, that might be why we haven't seen it. And there's a lot to be said for rule of cool,
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to say as well in terms of what we're writing and what is worth writing is that, okay, when you're writing for a book, you're absolutely right. You have to write just the things that you need for your book and maybe something around it to make it more stable. But when you're writing for RPGs, we do not write for the players. Like when you are creating a world, you are writing for your players because you're the GM and you're writing a world for your players. But when you're writing a campaign setting, you're in fact writing for storytellers. And that is a completely different approach because they don't need to know the things that the players know. They need to know the secrets of your world, and you need to define them in a way that they can actually play with them and create their own stories and make the world seems interesting, right? Like I found it always very frustrating that you will create a campaign setting, and the campaign setting can be read by the player the same way that it can be read by the storyteller. And for me,
Yes.
you kind of need World Anvil secrets to say to the storyteller, you know what? This is saying that this city is essentially beautiful and things like that, but actually, the story that you should know is that actually that like there are like mind flayer overlords essentially taking over, and nobody else should know about it because then it will break immersion. And the only game I've ever seen doing that was a game which I have here. In fact, it's called Engel. It's a German game. It was just produced once, and sadly was not produced again. But effectively, it was saying clearly, this is not a book for you, player. The book for your player is actually a much smaller book that you get there. This is for the storyteller. And I don't know, should I say what the secret is or should I not? Anyway, I won't say what the secret is, but I will say that in the players, it's introduced like you are an angel after the apocalypse, and you're taking care of the mortals in like essentially, and you're part of a church of one of the 9 churches essentially of Raphaelites and whatever they are essentially. The truth is completely different, and that was the beauty of the book because you've learned about it as a storyteller, but the players have no idea. And the problem is that you only play this game once, because once you learn the mistake, the thing, then it kind of breaks the game, kind of thing.
I think you've hit on something really interesting there, which is how much of plot holes are unreliable narrator.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Because you can use plot holes like that to signify that there is an unreliable narrator in play, and that's actually a very clever way to use this. Is to lay down a fact, contradict the fact with the narrator, and then later on, of course, that would become a plot point, I would hope, because if you have an unreliable narrator, like Chekhov's gun, you'd better see it come into play at some point. Otherwise, people are just going to get angry.
You're saying, what about taking it one step further? What about an unreliable world builder? So not just a narrator, but actually the person who's documenting your world is, if it's not actually you as the author, but maybe it is someone who's documenting it and they're not 100% reliable, either intentionally or maybe just because they don't know.
Yeah, this is something that's touched on in and I know you're not much of a D&D-er, but in the Pathfinder Society, because the Pathfinder Society, the whole concept of it is that it's a learned society of explorers and historians who go out and they give provenance to the world building, essentially. They go out and explore, they go out and discover, and then they write it all down. So all the stuff that you get, all the material that you get already has provenance, is already a secondary source, and therefore is already somewhat doubtable.
Yes. And I think I quite like that in the world building, because then it also gives you as an author or a creator, let's use that term, but to then come back and go, actually, yes, I did miss something, but that was just my the person who discovered it. We've had another discovery that has managed to rectify that.
On the other hand, if during your scaffolding you have set the truth, like you have essentially document saying these are the truths of the world, regardless of how I'm going to be presenting them, I think it gives you a bit more the opportunity to, when you do the twists, to plan them better and to make them more interesting, because you know how they're going to be hooked up later on. So it's kind of like divine providence that nobody knows, but you know, and you can work with it essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I see that we are moving ever towards question time. I would like to ask you, Nate and Dimitri, what is your approach to world building to prevent this? This being plot holes.
Plot holes. Well, I kind of answered that from my side. I think the easiest way for me is to write a document which I call meta or whatever this is, and this is essentially like my rules of the world, my truths of the world. And there, for example, I'll say no matter what's happening, or no matter what now, for example, there are no gods, and this is not essentially anything else. It's an alien race that create a virtual reality world, and everybody's everybody's a player in there. Like this, probably nobody will ever know, but this will guide my decisions and will guide also the events, because I can always go back to that and say, does this play with that? And if that plays with that, that's fine, essentially. I mean, and that explains essentially most of my world.
Yeah, I suppose for me, I do use that idea of an unreliable narrator. Yeah, I've got my own little character, and I'm not quite decided yet if he can travel through time, and that's what he does, or whether he's a fixed point in time. But that's kind of what in my worlds, I'm using him as that central point.
That's really cool. I think for me, it's very much about considering what changes I've made compared to Earth 1, this world, and considering from all different personal perspectives how that affects life. How does that affect life on the big scale? So, like, how does it affect the species? How does it affect the geography? That very, very big stuff. How does that then affect the sapient species? How does that then affect the cultures? And finally, how does that then affect the boots on the ground experience of everyday people in all situations of life and in all stages of life? So from infancy to geriatricity, and from rich people to poor people, and then also different people in various worlds. And this doesn't need to be a long conversation I have to have with myself, but I do have to sit and think this through, because these are things which have ramifications. And if you can exploit something, people will exploit it. So you better figure out how they're going to do that, because that will happen if people are aware of it, and they can make things from it, or they can make better life, or they can make somebody else's life worse. They will do that.
Yeah.
And how do you double check that your world isn't broken?
Beta readers, I'm guessing. But I think what you described there was a beautiful example of a good process document. Like you say, you're working through methodically, and then what goes well with a good process is the good way that you document that process, and as you go through each step. So I think having those two things, you as an author knowing, or as a world builder, being able to track the changes you have made, but then also relying on that strong relationship with your beta readers or players to actually go, hang about, you've missed a little bit here, and then go back and look at how you can tweak it.
For me, it's Munchkins.
Munchkins.
Munchkin players for role-playing games are the best people, because they will try to abuse every single thread of anything you've done wrong. So having a player in your campaign that he's a Munchkin, or two, in fact, that's even better, will make sure that the next time you play this role, you know your mistakes and you know what they try to abuse. So yeah, that's my method, essentially, finding a Munchkin to play with.
I like that. I like that one.
So yeah, I definitely agree. Having beta readers, having writing groups, or we now have chapters in World Anvil in our Discord community. So they function like writing groups, but they're for world building. So anything like that where you can pitch your world, pitch your ideas, and somebody else with other eyes will say, "Hang on a minute, what about this?" And I know one experience of somebody who they made this magical world which had loads of magic in it, and somebody looked at it and in a very kind, very nice, very constructive way said, "Why isn't this world a post-scarcity world? Look at all the magic. Why?" And they saw this, and to give this world builder the credit, they saw this, thought, that's a really interesting question, and then they went away and made a much more interesting world.
Real. That's great.
And that's the thing I really want people to take away from this, is that if you have something in your world that doesn't work, that is an opportunity to spin much more interesting things. If it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? If this thing happens, like if your islands are floating, that's really interesting. Why are they floating? And what can you do with that? So in Dimitris' world, he has floating islands, but because he's used a magical form of quantum entanglement, he now has floating ships.
Nice.
Because he thought about why the islands were floating, and he went forward with that, and he introduced new mechanisms which made sense with the world. And now the world is much more interesting because he knows how the magical ships fly. It's not just hand wavium. there's a mechanism, which means that there's a supply and a demand, which means that there's all sorts of new interesting conflict there. All of that came out of how does this work? And you see it time and time again with worlds as people fix these plot holes or whatever they are, these things where worlds are broken, they come up with much more interesting worlds and much more unique worlds because they're thinking through another step. So everything is more integrated, everything is more interesting. So yeah, that's the point I'd like to leave that on. But we have a whole load of questions. So our first question is from our VIP Bad Shilly. He asks, how would you handle adding in previous civilizations, i.e. it's easy to come up with nations and factions that still exist, but what about those that came before?
How would you add? Is that the question?
So how do you integrate past civilizations into your world? I think that is the question.
I think, I don't remember where I heard it the other day, but the idea is that you cannot have D&D if you don't have past civilizations, because you don't have any ruins, you don't have any dungeons, you don't have any unspeakable secrets to go and kill things because of kind of thing. So I think the integration of, for my side at least, I don't integrate ancient civilizations. I build based on the history of the world. So I'm not trying to shoehorn them. I'm considering the history of my world from the time they existed, even if it's not in greater detail, because that will give me information about how the world will look like. Because when civilization dies, like even, for example, before Dark Ages, collapse of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire would have been the ancient civilization for many of those places. Like essentially, they would have essentially ruins from the Roman Empire, from works of architecture, roads, temples. All of those would have been essentially the ancient times for people in the 700s AD kind of thing. You don't have to write the whole of the Roman Empire, but by writing a little bit about what it was and why it was and how it fell, or generally speaking the idea, you will have so much more wealth to draw from when it comes to what you're building around it. That's my idea. What do you think, Nate?
I agree. I think what I do say is flavors. So your current civilization should have flavors of what has been passed. So if you've got a particular something that's very maybe unique, or not even unique, maybe it's just something that's quite mundane about your culture, take that and work out how is that a flavor or representation of the civilizations that have gone before them. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, and that's a good point, because you don't have to effectively write everything about them. You don't want that, but you have to give them a flavor, like essentially ancient Greco-Roman civilization that believed in big hillbillies kind of thing and dark gods kind of thing, and they have temples of that. Or, for example, Babylonian civilization loves blue gold and they have chimeras kind of thing. You know, like these kind of feelings that essentially they can be translated into the architecture of the buildings, the traditions they had, the monsters you will find, the treasure you will find. All of that would have been coming from that, as you said, like theme of the culture and theme of the place kind of thing.
Yeah. And you can merge those themes and tie them so that, like say, if you're looking at that Roman civilization, what came before, you know, you've got the tribes that would have originally created Rome, but then as Rome goes on, it's also acquired other cultures to then get that melting pot that you've got of this whole different civilization.
I think, sorry.
I was about to say that it's not surprising that we still pretty much speak a language that came from Latin in most of the Western world. Like Rome was destroyed, the empire at some point collapsed completely and it became smaller pieces, but every little small piece held some of the information there. So you might never have the whole story, but you're not coming out of nowhere. Like they didn't like sprout out like mushrooms out of nowhere. They were Romans at some point, and then they were not, kind of thing. You know, they just evolved into something else.
It's also worth noting that these things are relatively local. So unless you had a worldwide empire in the past, people won't necessarily know very much about it.
Very true.
In the medieval era, the average man on the street knew nothing about the Romans. Really nothing, like nothing. We didn't in the West know about ancient Egyptian culture until Napoleon got to Egypt. There was one book called Pyramidographia, which was published by a man in 1673, I think. But no, until the end of the 18th century, we really had no idea about ancient Egyptians whatsoever. The Greeks knew about them, but the Greek understanding of ancient Egyptians was also really wonky.
Also very Greek.
Again, exactly. We knew about the civilizations in the Bible, of course, because the Bible was kind of a big deal in the early modern era. But we didn't know really anything about them. We couldn't really read Phoenician at all. We couldn't read Hebrew properly, most people. So it's worth remembering that reception history works differently for different levels of information.
Talking about reception history, don't forget that essentially in the old Bible, you would actually know about Egypt, but a completely different way, right? There were the tyrants that the Hebrews escaped and they went to the Holy Land. So this is also the way that history is warped, and reception is actually a great way of actually explaining that. People will know what they know. History is written by the victors, but the victors have to survive to essentially have the history they want written, essentially.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, again, in the 18th century, people would go on the Grand Tour, which is, I'm a massive history buff, incidentally, so I do apologize for this. People would go on the Grand Tour, and they would, as part of their like finishing and becoming a worldly gentleman, they would take a travel around Europe and pick up random bits of artifacts and art and this kind of stuff. And one of the favorite things that I've ever seen in a house is a matching pair of Roman, I think, figurines, one original and one fake, because things sold better as matching pairs. So people really, even in the 18th century, did not know what they were buying. They had no idea. They weren't specialists. They knew they were buying a thing, and beyond that, they really had no idea. And for example, things like the definition between Zeus and what's his name? Serapis, which is the Ptolemaic version of Zeus, Aramis.
Sorry, Theas who became Zeus, and
exactly.
Zeus and Ra who became Serapis by essentially combining the melting pot of what used to be essentially.
Exactly. So this like Phoenician mishmash pantheon, which also had other deities in as well, and completely misunderstood.
Actually, that was Greek. That was the only thing that that is Greek, and it is actually Greek. The gods are Greek. The language is not Greek, it's Phoenician. The numbers are not Greek, they're Phoenician. The gods are Greek.
Serapis is Greek, but is a Greek mishmash with an Egyptian god.
Egyptian, not Phoenician, Egyptian.
Yeah, exactly. And there's another one called Hippocrates, who was a complete misunderstanding of the child of Osiris. And he became a god of secrecy because he was doing this, which to the Greeks looked like a secrecy thing, but to the Egyptians meant something completely different. So there's this weird reception history thing where it goes all the way through, and then by the time they get to the 18th century, they find these statues and they call them Cupid. It's something else again.
And at the same time, just to be clear, Hippocrates still means in Greek what you now call hypocrisy here in English. So that is where it's coming from. It comes from this god who actually got renamed, and now it means hypocrisy. So that's where it's coming from. Just understand like how the reception actually changes completely.
Sure. So you can see these are the stories of how things filter into everyday life. It's really like reception history is responsible for a lot of mess ups. And this is the kind of super interesting thing that you can include in your world, is you can take stuff that is relevant to your everyday life and then retroactively break it so that it is something from the past, if you see what I mean.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around.
Or create something and then break the hell out of it until you have something that's not recognizable but anyone, and gives a completely different meaning, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's how I would integrate historical societies, is I would make those links and I would put them through the filthy lens of history and misunderstanding, and then you end up with these really and again, that's a great way to include an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Onto another question. If worlds have gods, how much inconsistency does this allow? And how much does it require for the gods to have meaningful power in the world? This is a question from Eder Andrew.
Well,
Eder Andrew.
I would say one thing, and I'm sorry, I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone right now. Considering that we have no proof of God right now, and in theory gods don't exist, how much impact they have right now in the world? I would say that they have profound impact in the world. Like even the idea of a god has a profound impact in the world. So my simple answer for that would be that your gods can have as profound or as minimal impact you want them to have. And the question is not how much your gods have impact, is how much meaning. If the god does not exist, how much meaning people put in their gods. If they exist, how much they interact with the world.
I think this question refers not to sociological implications, but to physical properties of the world implications.
Oh.
So if you have a god, can you have deity-created circular mountains? Can you have spheres of water that hang in the air for no reason other than the god willed it?
It depends. Can it be sustained by the world?
Yeah.
Like
really
somebody created, but can it be sustained?
And plus you could argue that God is still sustaining those elements in your
fair
world.
enough, yeah. But then we're talking about permanent magic, right? Like permanent sacrilegious power, whatever this is called, yeah.
I think Final Fantasy as a game series is brilliant at doing that kind of things. Especially if I remember correctly, the Final Fantasy 13 had a lot where the gods were actually massive beings within the world, and they were either holding elements up or they doing other different things within the world. So yeah, I think that's one example there.
Very cool. I think it depends a lot on what paradigm of god you choose.
Yeah.
If it's a god that has magic, if it's a god that is fueled only by prayer, if it's a god that, like Terry Pratchett's gods, for example, is it a god that's actually not a god at all, but an alien, as was visited in lots and lots of things, including Stargate, that's the word I was looking for, where that was a paradigm you saw repeatedly, where the deities were actually aliens of different kinds, or alien parasites, or this, these kinds of entities. So I think the leeway you have in that is really related to how God-flavored your god is and which God-flavored your god is.
And what your people define as God. I'm not 100% sure if this is an Einstein quote or not, but effectively, and I will paraphrase, but effectively, whoever said it, and I think it was Einstein, said that at some technological levels, magic is indistinguishable from science because it's a matter of perception.
Yeah.
It is as simple as that.
And that was absolutely, again, one of the things that Star Trek took on as Stargate took on as a trope. Is that you see with the very advanced races, they have magic where things just happen and it doesn't look like technology anymore. And that's another technological level where it's so technologically advanced, it doesn't even look like technology anymore.
It doesn't even have to be, in truth, right? Because if it's so powerful that it can actually change your life completely and utterly, I mean, call it whatever you want, it is all powerful for your eyes only, essentially.
On Twitter, there's a great, I'll have to find it and I'll send it through to you, but it's talking about how we appear to ants, and it's a great analogy of God, and that can, I'll find it and I'll send it, and you can.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, thank you, bud.
Very cool. That sounds really interesting. We've got a question here. We have a question here from Techube22. It's a really interesting one, I think. What value is there in having a broken world?
Nate?
Value.
Here you are. Take the hard one.
I suppose then, falling back, easy answer is what we've been talking about, that what you're trying to get across to your reader or the people that come into your world. So again, it's that unreliable narrator. If you want to take that route, if you didn't want to go down that route, what value is there in a broken world?
Discovery of the truth, if it's not broken, or is it a discovery of, I mean, if it is actually broken, why is it broken? Because, if it's broken, really broken, then it wouldn't work at all. It wouldn't be a world. It would be like chaos.
And maybe there's some interesting things to play with within a broken world like that. Like I say, I think I've got in my notes why is the greatest question that we can ask as writers, and continually asking that of your world. So, Janet, you're gonna.
Yeah, I was going to say that within the paradigm of whatever, so within the space of however you have used your world, if you've used your world for a book or if you've used your world for an RPG campaign, no matter how broken it appears to anyone, even yourself as the author, it exists. It clearly exists. In the space of disbelief, this world exists. So there's no such thing in that way as a broken world. If it's a world that contradicts itself, that's a world that asks really interesting questions. That's a world that you can dig into.
That
So
is a
I
very
would argue,
metaphysical way of saying it. I would say that, yeah, but yeah, it's fair enough. Yeah, it's fair enough. Yeah.
so yeah, I would argue that there is no such thing as a broken world. But as you go through your world building process, you have to decide what you want to present. What's your vision? And if your vision is a world that contradicts itself, that's fascinating. How are you going to leverage that in terms of your RPG campaign, your narrative? Exactly. Yeah. And if it's a world where you feel like it's broken, but you don't want it to be broken, or you want it to be less self-contradictory, then start looking at the aspects and figuring out why they work like that, or what you could do to fix them, and what ramifications that would have. Spin the wheel and see where that lands you, because as we were saying with Dimitri's world before, you know, by figuring out why the islands floated rather than just magic, all of a sudden he came up with a whole interesting, fascinating thread, which then fueled the narrative and the conflict for his world. So these are gems. They are gems in the rough. When we find these problems, they are opportunities for us to create unique and fascinating worlds and conflict and all this great stuff. So I would argue that there's no such thing as a broken world. And if your world isn't as you want it, or if you find a big gaping plot hole that you don't want to be there, keep digging, keep figuring out why, and you'll find gems in there.
Diggy hole. So what's the next question?
Yes, absolutely. We have a question. When you start world building, what do you feel is the best thing to start with? And I think that's with
oh dear God.
with reference to making sure that you don't have these kinds of supernatural or natural boo-boos. Like how do you make a complete world, and where do you start with that?
Okay, so, well, there's so many ways you can go with this question, and it's trying to pick the right, or not the right path, but a path through it. And I guess that's kind of what I was trying to do with that framework that we talked about at the very start, was where do you start in world building, and what if you want to start at one point but then go back. So quickly to go through it, I create this idea of threes, and that you've got the universe, the planet, and the people. And if you start at the universe, you're looking at things like cosmology, magic, science, gods, but then that moves down to your planet with your tectonic plates, your geography, but then similarly down to your people, you've got sociology, economic, civilizations. So you can start at any point that you want, but you've got to understand then the relationship between those three layers. So I guess with world building, the beauty is that there isn't. The beauty and the frustration is that there isn't a perfect place to start. Would you guys agree, or have any different takes?
I think that there is not a place to start, but I think there are some certain structures that you need to put in place based on what you are world building for. So that will change depending on what you're trying to world build for. Yes. And I think that A, you need context. B, you need to understand why you're. For me, honestly, if you ask me the first question is, why am I building what I'm building? Because if you don't know this, you are destined to fail.
Fantastic question. Yeah.
Because if you don't know what you're building it for, at some point you get demotivated, and without knowing why you have done it and going back and say, okay, that's why I've done it, and refocus, you will lose the will to live. Essentially, that is as simple as that. So for me, that's where I start. And I have a post-it note most of the times saying, for example, I'm building this world because I want to explore how, for example, quantum entanglement can be used as magic. Or I'm using this world because I want to play with the concept of, for example, what if we were all living upside down? Or what if we were all in a game? Or whatever this might be. And or I'm building all because I want just like write maps about it, and I want to create a map about that. It can be as simple as that, or it can be as simple as I want to build a world because I want to torment my players, which I often do.
Yeah. And I think sometimes a world just comes to you. Like sometimes for me it's a character. I might have a character that just is popped in my head, and I'm fleshing out who is he, what they're doing, what powers do they have, what does that mean upon their world, and it's only then that I then maybe move to looking at maps and the cosmology and that kind of stuff. But certainly sometimes my favorite place to start is maps, because that's kind of where I'm most comfortable, and then from maps I would then progress on to like characters. But I think it does depend on. I think Dimitris actually was the answer.
I think for me, it depends on what I want to use it for. If I'm building a D&D world, it's going to look different because I want to do different things with it. If I'm building a world that I want to tell a story in, then that world is going to support that story. So if I'm telling a story that's one of the themes is like gender interaction, then maybe I'm going to have 3 genders. Maybe I'm going to have 5 genders, because that's something I want to explore in the story. And so necessarily I'm going to create a biological species that has more biological sexes, or that has more gender options for 2 biological sexes. Right there. That's my hook. That's my world.
Good. Yeah.
I would also like to say that I have linked in the chat a video which is called Tips for Starting Your New World. This is a video that I made, and it goes through things that you should think about when you're starting a new world. That is motivation, genre, scale, mood, theme, and conflict. These are all really, really important things to think about before you start doing big world building stuff, because they're going to really help you build something that's cohesive and fit for purpose, whatever your purpose is, as addressed by motivation.
And I have put up our Lost Kingdom article that had actually just 12 points to go for when you do starting world building. That was like a very old article.
There you are. So this is something we've thought about before, because people ask us a lot.
Yes, of course. I think all 3 of us in different ways, and definitely.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to answer one more question because it is already getting late. So this question is from True Undead Hero, who is also our boss right now. Any other books you can recommend to read about world building in general, I think, and also probably our topic of the month, which is integrating natural and supernatural laws.
I saw the question before, and I brought some of the books here during the break.
So we're prepared.
So shall I show what I have here, and then Nate can do the same thing, I'm guessing?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that sounds like a great idea.
Controversial one.
First book by Trent, and we'll talk about it next time as well. Collaborative world building. Beautiful
this is
book.
Sorry, Dimitri. This is Dr. Trent Hagenrader's collaborative world building for writers and players, or gamers, I think it's called. It is a truly wonderful book, and even if you're not building in a collaborative team, it has an awful lot of helpful information about how to world build, how to go about world building, the things you should focus on. Highly recommended.
For inspiration, The Imaginary World of, which is a really nice book as well. Just if you want to go through an exercise effectively to play around.
And that was what TJ put us on to.
Yes, it is. Then I have something from Stephen Algillet, which is World Building, Writer's Guide to Constructing Star Systems, Life Support Planets. This is for science fiction writers, and it is a beautiful piece of work. It's a very old book. I'm pretty sure you can find it on Amazon. It is quite filled with a lot of information. It's quite tightly packed. It's a good resource to have on your site if you're writing science fiction. Again, for science fiction, that is one of my old favorites, Planet Construction Kit. Very weird book. Interesting though, it's built like a reference and it will give you some basic information to start worlding. Then we have from Orson Scott Wells.
Orson Scott
Wells, yeah, sorry. Wells? Oh, Oscar Wells, yeah.
You're thinking about H.G. Wells.
Yes, I do. How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy. Really good book. Excellent book. I might not be able to say his name, but I like his work. Then, if you really want to go deep into sociology, I think this is a book that every world builder should read at least once. Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Excellent way of how you call that? Reproducing your story and checking your history. Like when you asked before, Janet, how do we check against your world? Reading a book like that and sense checking what you've written, that's going to be a good idea. And finally, I have this one, which I haven't read in total just yet, but it's a beautiful book. It is quite beautifully designed.
It's got a lot of images in it as well, doesn't it? That one.
Yes, it is quite a
Very artistic.
It's a very artistic book, but I've heard great works about it, and I'm trying to read it. So that it does not come a recommendation that I have checked, but it comes from many of my friends that told me that they love the book. So
very cool.
Yeah.
All right, are you through your stack there, Dimitri?
I'm through my stack, indeed.
Awesome. Nate, talk to us.
Cool. So I've got the one that I mentioned at the beginning, which was Building Imaginary Worlds by Mark J.P. Wolf. I'd say it's a heavy book, but it's a brilliant book. Well worth a read. I quite like the Kobold's Guide to World Building.
Oh, yes.
There's some beautiful little short articles in here that you can just read, and it's just, yeah, I really like. And then got maybe a controversial one. If you're into science and you're looking for ways of looking at science and creation and evolution, is Evolution's Achilles' Heels. And this is 9 PhD scientists, top of their field, but they're all creationists. And they're looking at different elements of evolution. And so everything from, let me pull up the, let's have a look. This is brilliant.
That would be good world building, I guess, because they had to do a lot of it.
I got things from natural selection, genetics and DNA, origins of life, fossil records, geologic records, and like I say, it's people that are top PhDs in each of these different fields, writing their own thesis upon evolution and creation, and it's fully science. It's mind blowing, some of the stuff that's in that book.
Very interesting.
I definitely recommend having a read.
Very cool. It reminds me actually of the time that I was trying to find inspiration for ancient Egypt and writing about ancient Egypt, but from a sort of fantastical perspective. And I watched a documentary, one of these sort of
ancient aliens.
Ancient aliens, pyramids healed my baby. I'm secretly a jackal god kind of documentaries, like real bottom of the barrel documentaries. So inspiring for historical nonsense. Oh my goodness. I would like to say that as well as really, really terrible documentaries are inspiring for world building, this is currently my reading baby. Yes, it's as wide as my face. It is a fantastic book, and books like this, I've got Europe history, I've got all sorts of other historical books, again, big history nerd, documentaries about animals as well, and documentaries about geography, about geology, about how the world works. This kind of factual first world information, I know it's not world building stuff in the traditional sense, but figuring out how our own world works is so inspiring for thinking about how another world will function. And we don't have to be specialists in everything, but it is really a great place to get inspiration and to get, the hook of an idea about where you can go with a new world or a new project. All right, so that pretty much wraps us up for this week. It has been absolutely wonderful to talk to you, Nate. Thank you so much for joining us for World Building Scaffolding. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for all your wisdom. You can find more about Nate on the World Building School. Nate also uses World Anvil. I don't know if he has a World Anvil world that is public, but if he does...
Not yet.
Not yet. Soon. All right, well, look forward to hearing about Nate's world soon. Hopefully he will give us deets when that goes live.
But you can always go to his blog once again and his website. Tell us about it, Nate, just to...
Yes, it's worldbuildingschool.com. Just lots of different articles. Like I said, this year is going to be a revamp of the site, new platform, and hopefully get more articles on. Because there's lots and lots I want to write about. So
awesome.
I'm really, really looking forward to that. And guys, there is so much on there already. You should absolutely go and check it out. World Building Gold. All right, guys, we'll be signing off now. So thank you everyone for being here. And I am going to go over to the Discord and we'll have a quick chat about world building and about what we've been talking about today. Dimitri is definitely going to go open the wine now. That's happening. So guys, from all of us here, have a wonderful Sunday and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye, guys.
See you later.